Hello DIY boys and girls. In this video you'll see me build a Bluetooth speaker with natural materials like cork and rattan. If you'd like to know how to build one yourself, then stay tuned to see the complete process. I started out with the electrical components I bought from Sound Imports. It's a plug-and-play package that is perfect for a beginner like myself. The main module is this KAB250V4 Class D amplifier from Dayton Audio. It has a 2x50 watt output power and 5.0 Bluetooth receiver. To power this puppy, I'm using this Dayton Audio extension board that can hold three 18,650 lithium-ion batteries. And with this KPX in-circuit programmer board, I can fully customize the sound to my preference. The whole package comes with a manual that indicates where everything goes, so now I only have to follow the instructions. But before I start connecting all the components, I first need to alter the rocker switch like somebody who is not happy with the rocker switch but likes to have a push button instead because it fits the design much better type of person. And this is exactly what happened next. Next up, I prepared the power supply to charge the batteries. The cable comes without the DC connector attached to it, and since I don't like to have loose ends, I soldered a DC connector to it. On the back of the amplifier module, there is an indication of the polarity with VCC being the plus and GND being the minus. Compare this to the icons on your adapter and connect accordingly. If you don't, there's a short circuit. The amp gets broken and tears will flow. Before installing the batteries, I checked with the multimeter to ensure that they had the same voltage. A different voltage means a higher current flow, that equals damage, and that equals tears. I had to use a small screwdriver to push in the antenna, and the rest, well, it's pretty self-explanatory. In fact, I have the IQ of a teapot. I'm just smart enough to Google things, so if I can handle this, so can you. At the connector port for the volume knob and the aux cable, you will see these two connectors. They have to be removed in case you use a volume knob. If you have the same religion as I, then you're not allowed to use such knob. Then you need these connectors to prevent noise and more tears. Once I was done plugging everything I could possibly plug, I switched on the module to check if all was working as it should. Then I continued to pat myself on the shoulder for this outstanding live performance. The speakers I'm using for this project are these 4-inch 60 watt full range audio drivers from Dayton that can be connected with simple speaker connectors. With all the electrical stuff done, I only had to ask my one and only friend in life, ChatGPT, to help me calculate the best volume for the speaker setup. Then I converted my vision into a CAD model and checked if the volume was as recommended by my dear friend. In the description you will find links to the technical drawings as well as to a picture of a dog that looks like a cheerleader. For the housing of the speaker I decided to work with plywood as it is more suitable for this design than MDF. I started with the back panel as this becomes my foundation for the rest of the build. I've cut it to width and I'm using a router with a circle cutting jig for perfectly circular curves. For the front panel I'm using a jigsaw to roughly cut it to shape. Then I mounted this onto the back panel with two screws in the center of my circles, and now I only had to trace it with a flush trim bit to end up with the exact same shape as the back. I know. This was indeed a visionary idea, and if I were you, I would also wish I could think of that. The next amazing thing is that the two screw holes also provided me with the exact centers on the front panel to position my jig to mill out the recesses for the speakers. To install the middle board, I also milled out a groove in the back and the front panel. This was not amazing, but still great. Now I could focus on the holes for the magnets. I used this automatic center punch that I like so much I got a bit carried away. With the holes indicated, I used a normal drill bit to make the pockets for the magnets. I used a Forstner bit and a router bit to get an exact hole for the power button. And since I was drilling anyway, I also seized the moment to drill the hole for the Bluetooth button as well for the DC plug. Next task was to cut the frame for the mesh. Again, I used a jigsaw to cut myself a rough shape that I stick to the front panel with double-sided tape, so I could trace it with the router for perfect alignment with the other panels. Cutting the holes for the speakers was easy with this hole saw. I started drilling from the back to prevent the hole saw from finding its way into the recesses I've made before. The drilling went pretty smooth, but I noticed that the plywood I bought looked like the inside of puff pastry. It's tasty, but completely useless for woodworking. Instead of shedding many tears, I decided to add some glue to the loose parts and continue with the build. I also noted that the back panel was rather thin for the screws to get decent grip, so I quickly cut 2 pieces of wood to add some meat and glued them to the back panel as if it was nothing. In the mid panel I made a cut for the battery pack cable. Then I installed it with some wood glue and a straight edge for correct positioning, also as if it was nothing. At this point, all was still very accessible, so before installing the rest of the housing, I could now get all electrical components into place. With some homemade superglue, I added some spacer for proper cooling and easy installation. Because I'm too lazy to cut all the cables to the exact length, I just use tie wraps as a cable management system. Please don't hate me for this. To get an airtight chamber, I'm using this liquid silicone in the small holes and around the plug, switches and the cables. Now I could add the front panel and some orienting blocks that help to keep the structure strong and straight. I also used some liquid silicone to restore my little puff pastry adventure I had going on in the speaker holes. To allow the mesh to be clipped to the front panel, I'm also installing magnets in the frame. Just like the other holes, this one blew out as well as I was drilling. But don't be sad, I fixed it with my homemade superglue and carried on with my business as usual, to end up with a magnetic frame unlike anything you've ever seen. I pre-drilled the holes for the speakers and added some screws in the center of the frame to prevent it from bending. Speaking of which, it was time to start with the curve bending of the plywood. I used this online calculator to determine the right spacing and depth for the cut. As with every new step, I made a test piece first to determine if it works. In the first piece, I made cuts along the wood grain, and as you can see, it failed like I failed in life. When cutting against the grain, it gave me a much better result as the plywood became as flexible as a thin slice of freshly cut ham. With full confidence, I now defined the straight parts of the top and bottom and indicated the curve cuts with a straight edge. I use the track saw for this setup, but you can just work with a large ruler and a circular saw as well. There's absolutely no need to be fancy here. At the joint, I left the straight pieces a little bit longer so I could take the measurements directly from the panels to cut them to length. To give the front panel some space for easy installation, I milled out a small groove over the complete front side. After a final checkup of the LEDs, I could start with the installation of the housing panel. I used polymer glue for the initial fixation, as this allows me to glue up the rest without having to worry about it moving. Because if that happens, just imagine the amount of tears that would flow. The next day I filled up the cuts with wood glue to close everything up, again using polymer glue on edges for air tightness. And now I just bent over the housing panel, clamped it together for a couple of hours, and then I repeated the process on the other side. As the housing was drying, I got started on the mesh panel. I clamped the rattan to my workbench, defined the position for the frame, added some epoxy glue to the back of the frame and clamped it firmly into place like a professional mesh builder. Now I just had to cut it out along the frame and be amazed with what I just pulled off. After I cooled down from my excitement, I started with the cutouts for the opening hook that allows me to lift the mesh from the speaker. The housing was almost done, and I have to say that I kind of like the faceted edges as they are. It's a lucky accident that I might use in my next design. Or maybe not. I don't know actually. Then I made sure to fully close any remaining cracks or openings using the liquid silicone. The experience was truly amazing. I also made sure to remove any excess silicone before it would harden out, as it would become an insufferable bother. And I heartily recommend you follow suit. With a layer of spray paint, I matched the color of the wood behind the mesh with the color of the speakers for a uniform result. Moving into the final stage of the build, I will be needing cork. Lots of cork. This is how it's going down. You take wine cork, preferably from red wine, and you slice it up to the thickness that you need. Then you need to make straight edges like so, and stick them together with wood glue. If you are somewhat nifty, you should end up with a sheet that looks as perfect as this one. And if you're not buying this, then I'll come up with something else. I started out with the back panel because I don't want to have any seams on the enveloping surface, as this looks a lot more minimalistic. After adding marker to the buttons, I pressed the speaker into the cork to ensure I had the exact position for cutting. With my drill press on the highest speed and a router bit, I was able to get somewhat of a nice hole. For the power button, I had to make a countersunk to compensate for its protrusion. And with a generous squirt of waterproof wood glue, I mounted the first cork panel to the back of the speaker. Just like that. After drying, I removed the majority of the cork with the blade. Then I added some tape to the guide of my router bit to compensate for any shrinkage of the cork. Well, thank you. That is indeed an astoundingly clever move. As I happen to be in a milling mood, I also milled out the front panel using the same router bit and the wood casing as a guide. In this amazing process, a piece of cork chipped off, but I just remained cool as a cucumber and used some super glue to repair it. Then I marked the inner cutout with a compass and removed it like a plastic surgeon who has a cork cutting hobby. The piece of cork felt really flimsy, so I added a thick layer of wood glue to give it some strength. Continuing with the enveloping flap, I marked the center, made myself a wooden jig, and drilled the holes for the LEDs to shine through. To bring the light to the top surface of the cork, I decided to use some clear 3D printing filament that I pulled out of my extruder. With pruning shears, I was able to make straight cuts that are needed for the best light transfer. The goal was to blend them in with the cork perfectly, so that when the LEDs are off, you don't really see them. Therefore, I made sure to level them with the top surface of the cork and fixate them with a drop of super glue. With this marvel being completed, I could now just repeat the process of adding cork to the housing with wood glue. Once again, I made sure to cut a piece of cork too big so I could trim it down later on for perfect fitting. I also made sure to have the seam on the bottom so that you don't see it from the top. I'm being really generous with the wood glue, but that's because I have lots of glue in stock and because the cork tends to absorb quite a bit as well. The nice thing about cork is that you can stretch it a bit for perfect fitting. I slice away part of the cork before using the router. My theory is that the router will eat out the cork less aggressively. But then again, maybe not. To have a perfect trim, I placed in the mesh and the cork front and used this as a guide for the router. If this should happen, then please don't cry, just repair it and move on with your life. To maintain that overall natural look, I elevated the Bluetooth and power button with wooden dowels that I installed with super glue. The only thing left to do is to adjust the equalization to my preferences by attaching the Dayton Audio KPX in-circuit programmer to my amplifier and PC. Once this final step was set, I removed the programmer board and assembled the speaker. So there you have it, a minimalistic cork and rattan Bluetooth speaker with 2x 30 watts RMS output power. This is plenty of power and the sound quality is much better than I expected in the beginning of this project. I would love to read in the comments what you think, and if I did something stupid, please share so we can all learn. And then I will not see you in the next video because I cannot see you, so you will be seeing me in the next video.